All right, good morning and welcome to the Missoula Public Library. For all the people in the room, how many have been here before? Holy smokes! Okay, I have to admit, this is my first time. Yeah. My bad, I've been busy. Okay, so my name is Dave Pappinger, and I have the privilege of serving as the chair of City Club Missoula. And welcome to the construction gap, why infill sites are slow to fill in. So thank you all for being here. City Club's mission is to bring people together to inform and inspire them on issues vital to the community through public forums that encourage the discussion of new ideas and free exchange of thought. We have a deep commitment to civility and civil discourse, even when discussing challenging issues. Before getting into the forum, let me get into the sincere thank yous. So first, thanks to Missoula Community Access Television, which records our forums as part of their media assistance grants to nonprofit organizations. MCAT serves our community on cable channels 189 and 190. MCAT only streams onto their Facebook page. Missoula's community media resource, the local live site no longer exists. So you can also find videos of the past City Club Missoula forums by checking on the video button on our website, cityclubmissoula.com. A special thank you to our sponsors, those at the executive level. They are Blackfoot Communications and First Security Bank. So without them, we struggle to put on forums. So we appreciate especially their partnership in helping expand our audience access and public awareness of upcoming forums. We're grateful to all of our sponsors and we invite you to join. And of course, thanks to our board of directors and our administrator, Jenny Rohrbach. She's out there up front, I'm sure. So today, you can see we've got a full panel. Our moderator for today's panel is Montana James. She is the Deputy Director for Community Development Division for City of Missoula. Did I say that right? Okay, give me 1 second here. Okay. So the Community Planning Development and Innovation Department. Montana was born and raised in Missoula and attended University of Montana for her undergraduate degree. She was awarded a Master of Public Administration from the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Policy and Governance in 2018. Wow, you're young. So Montana has worked in public service for over 15 years with experience in local, state, and federal government in both Washington State and Montana. She has expertise in policy implementation, organizational change, and community engagement. Montana is a deep believer in the transformative power of local government to build equitable, resilient, thriving local communities. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We have a fantastic panel today. I'm going to start with some introductions for each of these folks, and then we'll dive in. So to my right, we have Jill Sherman. Jill's a co-founder and principal at Edlen Company, a mission-driven real estate development firm that focuses on public-private partnerships, affordable and mixed-income housing, community facilities, and projects that push the boundaries of sustainability. Edlen Co is a woman-owned and B Corp certified company, and Jill sources new deals and manages all aspects of the development process with a depth of expertise at integrating non-conventional sources of financing. We like that here. including tax credits, bonds, and urban renewal funds. She holds a master's degree of urban studies from Portland State University and a Bachelor of Science of Economics from University of Pennsylvania. She serves on the Portland State University Center for Real Estate Advisory Board and as the Urban Land Institute District Council Chair for Portland. Next to Jill, we have Chris Chitty. Chris is a partner at Hone Architects and Builders, an integrated design firm, a design build firm focusing on custom residential and high performance building. He's lived in Missoula for 15 years and owned a home in the Franklin to the Fort neighborhood for 15. Chris has been building houses for 25 years and doing infill development for 10. He sits on the board of the Poverello Center, is a founding member of Pro Housing Missoula, and is on the Our Missoula Community Advisory Group. And last, we have Allan Frankl. Allan is a vice president for Dick Anderson Construction and leads the Western Montana business region. Allan grew up on a small cattle ranch in Phillipsburg, Montana. After graduating from Montana State University with an engineering degree in 1996, he joined Dick Anderson Construction as a project engineer, and since then he's managed an extensive range of projects from commercial buildings to schools to healthcare facilities to wind and solar. Thank you all for joining us today. So in way of introduction, I wanted to share a little bit more about what the Community Development Division does. We work to understand the housing market needs, and we also partner with local organizations to meet those needs. We focus especially on income-restricted homes to meet the needs of our lowest income residents, but also monitor the market and develop the local housing strategy as well. But we are often at the whims of the market in our ability to support projects. Because we operate federal and local grant and loan sources, they don't increase or adjust with inflation, to say the least. So when our community partners' projects slow down or come to a standstill because of the market that we're facing, our ability to meet those targets does as well. So the last few years have been particularly challenging, and I'm looking forward to digging in with this panel to understand a little bit more about what you're facing, what you're seeing as major drivers and cost in the market, and to kind of brainstorm potential solutions to meet our housing needs in spite of these market challenges. So thank you all for your time. And Jill is going to kick us off and talk a little bit about recent experiences in the rental market. Chris will then share a little bit about his experience creating infill home ownership. And then Allan will speak to some of the cost drivers in his experience. Thanks, Jill.
Is this on? Yes. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me today. As Montana mentioned, I do a lot of public-private partnerships as well as work with nonprofits, projects that have unconventional capital stacks and often perhaps where there isn't somebody necessarily looking for a return. The return is just getting the building built. But the projects I'm going to focus on today are projects where even though there's public-private partnership, the public sector is a partner, there's public policy objectives that the project wants to accomplish, the projects also have equity investors who are looking for a market rate of return. So when I'm talking about public-private partnerships in this context, I'm specifically referring to projects where the public sector is involved. They have, they're bringing something to the table. That's very often land. It can also be other types of incentives or financing tools to help bridge a funding gap in a project, and that's specifically what I'm referring to today. They also have, as I mentioned, public policy goals, so it's not just we want to see a building there, but perhaps we want to make sure we have a great design, a great active ground floor use, green building techniques, affordability, et cetera. So I'm a firm believer that the public sector and the private sector can actually accomplish things together that neither one of them can accomplish on their own. I have spent a lot of my career working on those types of projects. So, to level set, when we have these projects where we need to get a market rate of return for investors, decides what that means or what that return has to be? And I think sometimes people think that I do as the developer, and I kind of wish that I did, but that's not really true. It's really the investors, and the investors determine based on the perceived risk, the type of project, what and other alternatives that they have to invest their money, what type of return they'll require to invest in a project. And when we're underwriting a project early on, we're sort of guesstimating based on our experience what we think that return needs to be, and then we need to figure out how to make the cost and the income, all work together to hit that kind of return. And of course, debt is part of the financing as well in almost all cases, and so the cost of that debt, also something out of our control, is important as well. So I don't get to decide, exactly what's needed to make the project pencil, but I do need to make the project pencil in order to be able to move forward. So what I thought might be helpful would be to talk a little bit about Missoula and what we're finding here in our work as the selected developer working with the city on the old library block as compared to some other markets in the western region that we've been working and have completed some projects. And these are all rental projects, so these are apartments. Some of them have surface parking, some of them have structured parking. So, it's always very difficult to do apples to apples when you're trying, someone says, what does the project cost? And it's really not fair to compare across projects without digging a little bit more into the details of the project. So, be that as it may, I still think it's a useful comparison. So I looked at the initial sort of concept design and underwriting that we've done for the old library block here in Missoula. I looked at a project that we completed in 2021 in Spokane, or that we bid out in 2021 in Spokane, a project in Boise, Idaho, that we also bid out in about 2021, and then a project in Eugene, Oregon, that we recently bid out and hope to break ground on in early 2025. So obviously, we know inflation has been a huge, huge driver over the last few years, really more so than, the decades prior. So the first thing I had to do is figure out how to make those 2021 costs sort of similar or comparable to 2024 costs. So it's like, well, what was the inflation between 2021 and 2024? And, of course, I should have started asking general contractors this 2 weeks ago, but I didn't. So I was like, how am I going to find this out so that I can tell people when I have this, panel today? So I asked ChatGPT, and ChatGPT told me that between 2021 and 2024, construction costs increased between 15 and 30%, just in that 3-year period, which kind of felt, probably right. And I feel like probably on the high end of that. So I used 25%. So I took my hard cost per unit for those 2021 deals and increased it by 25% to get to something that might be equivalent to what that might cost today. So Spokane cost, the Missoula project on a per unit basis, hard cost only, 15% more expensive than that Spokane project, 29% more expensive than the Boise project, and 45% more expensive than the Eugene project. So pretty significant. Now, to be fair, the Boise project is only 3 stories and has surface parking, so that's a less expensive product type, which is in part driving that large difference. And the Eugene project, even though it's also a podium building, it has a lot of small units, whereas the Missoula project has some 2-bedroom units. So that's also why that's such a large difference. But even for the most comparable project, 15% more to build, similar product here. So, okay, what about the income side? That's the other side of the equation. How does that compare? So I took a quick look at CoStar, which is lumping together all of the apartments, whether they're old or new or in that area. So it's, again, an imperfect measure, but it's something. And I compared essentially studio rents, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom rents in Missoula as compared to Eugene, as compared to Spokane, as compared to Boise. So in Eugene, the rents are on average, market rents are on average 27% higher across those apartment sizes. In Spokane, it's 11% higher across those those unit types. And then in Boise, it's 41% higher. So you have sort of like the double whammy, more expensive to build and lower market rents. So those are, the sort of challenge that we're facing here to try to get particularly a dense urban project under construction. I look forward to more discussion and Q&A as we move the panel forward. Thank you.
Okay, I do have some slides, so hopefully they will magically appear on the big screens. Here we are. So as Montana said, my co-panelists exist on the larger end of the housing market, and I exist on the much smaller end of the housing market. So just keep that in mind when you're listening to what I have to say. So, infill, why is it so hard? There's lots of reasons, and we're going to talk about costs, and I'm going to focus mostly on what it takes to get a project started and completed. There's more parts to this story, but I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to focus on how difficult is it to take a project from 0 to 1. So what do you need to develop property? Spoiler alert, it's money. It's all just money. You need money, you need time, you need emotional resilience as a human, and you need a healthy risk tolerance. And all of that really boils down to just you need money. So in order to develop a property, you have to have equity in the property. Nobody just loans you all the money. So you need to have, and it's more than 20% like you would have for a home mortgage. You need 25, 30, sometimes more if you've got a riskier development. And I need to caveat that this is probably different than the numbers that Jill and Allan are used to working with. This is at the scale of, townhomes, fourplexes, that kind of thing. So 25 or 30%, this money comes in at the beginning of the project and you don't see it till the very end of the project. So, I always do the math for people because people don't like to do the math for themselves. Like if you're going to build a fourplex for $1.3 million, if you can do that, you're going to need to have $325,000 to $400,000 in cash that you don't need to do anything else with, that you're just going to lock up for however long it takes to get the project done. Time. In Missoula, when we're talking about infill projects, so not doing greenfield projects out on Mullen Road, we're talking about a weird little lot in the Franklin to Fort neighborhood. We're talking about tearing down a junky house and building a few more units on it. All the easy projects have already been done. All the low-hanging fruit has been picked. All the projects that are left need creativity, they need head scratching, they need back and forth with regulators. They're not straightforward. They take time. And that amount of time often can be years. It's really hard to buy a piece of property in 6 months, get it figured out, and then have it built in another 9. That doesn't happen very much. Even the most experienced developers will often be owning the property for years ahead of when they actually start construction. There's a couple of there's like 2 main buckets of infill development. One is the rental case, and in that case, oftentimes you have to get a rezone because the zoning that your piece of property has already isn't appropriate for what the development that you need to do in order to make it pencil. That often takes time. In the for sale case, you either need to do subdivision, and that takes 6 months to a year plus, depending on what you're doing, and isn't really appropriate for small scale development, or you're doing a townhome exemption development. And that often takes a year these days as well. So between buying a piece of property and selling a finished home, you're talking 1 to 3 years. There is a concept called the time value of money. You all look like very savvy people, so I'm sure I do not need to explain that. But that means that the money that you have invested has an opportunity cost. You could go right now and buy a money market for 4.5% and not have any risk and not have any headaches and need no emotional resilience. So if you're going to put your money at risk, you're going to want more than 4.5% return, ideally a lot more. Emotional resilience. So no matter which case you have, you need varying, you're going to get yelled at by different people. They're going to be unhappy with you. So in the rezone case, your neighbors are going to think that you're awful, greedy capitalists who hate the world. In subdivision, you also go to a public hearing, multiple public hearings, and you can ask some people in East Missoula about the Aspire subdivision, and they will tell you that they are the worst people that have ever lived. If you're doing townhome exemption development, luckily you do not generally have to go to a public meeting, but you do have to sort of navigate uncertain and shifting processes. I think I've done townhome exemption developments, 3 times in the last 4 or 5 years, and the process is always a little different. They're continually trying to make it better. They are trying to make it better. In my opinion, it doesn't always seem like it's better, but it is different. Sorry, Montana. Risk tolerance. Risk is all about the time that your money is locked away and under risk. So the things that you have no control over are global pandemics that create 30% inflation in construction costs. You can literally get a project underwritten by the bank and then 6 months later know that your budget is just completely unrealistic because of out of things that are out of your control. Rental sales prices, they can also fluctuate wildly. Generally in Missoula, that has gone in our favor, but it doesn't always happen that way. Regulatory changes in public opinion, all of these things are exacerbated with the amount of time that you spend with your money at risk. So, I don't know how much time I have left, hopefully enough. 3 minutes, oh God. I thought one of the best ways I could try to explain what makes an infill project pencil is to look at 2 different cases and pro forma. Don't look too heavily into the assumptions because good performers are all about good assumptions. But let's just take a case of buying a junky house on a decent lot in the Franklin to Fort neighborhood for $475,000 and trying to build 4 townhomes on that piece of property. You can see we have soft costs, design, engineering, insurance, legal. We have hard costs, construction costs. We have sales fees. We have the time value of money, once again. And that can equal $2.3 million. And then I think I can sell these places for about $2.3 million. Net profit of 0, equity required almost $600,000, return on investment 0. I got 2 minutes. Here we go. The next one, same piece of property. Instead of 4 townhomes, I'm going to build 8 condos. It's a little bit easier regulatorily because I don't have to go through some sort of TED. I can just do a condo. I get economies of scale in building 1 big unit instead of 4 smaller units. All of a sudden, my income is $3.2 million, but I've only spent 2.9. I've made a profit. My return on investment is 45%. Not bad. I'd do that. Keep in mind that 45% is annualized over 1, 2, 3, 4 years. So, the longer you're holding on to this thing, the less you're making, the less profit, the less return you're making on your investment. So the big conclusion there is that the things we don't control, construction costs, cost of financing, global financial ruin. The things we do control are the cost of land. We know we have for the same, I have halved the cost of land in my second case by allowing myself to build 8 units instead of 4. That is something, that is the one thing that we have control over in this whole equation. It's the lever we have, and I think we should pull it. We also control the transactions costs, and that's like how hard it is to get a project done. And if you want developers, greedy developers, to make less money, make the process less risky. Thank you.
Well, that's a strong act to follow. So I'm not really sure why I got invited to be here today. We're talking about housing, and we really don't do a lot of housing, but I thought I'd try to give some insight into just general construction costs in our experience in regards to that. First, I would like to say that it's just not developers that get beat up on. We show up on a job site and we get the same, so don't feel like you're selected away from everybody else. And Jill, just following up on your inflation, as a company, we do work all over the state of Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and down in Phoenix area and over by Chicago. And just through the COVID times, we tried to take similar projects from, across the spectrum and see what similar projects cost before COVID and similar projects costed after COVID. And I did not help make the flour behind the scenes. I just got to bake with it afterwards. And what came out of that was about 48% across our book of business. So there was a huge inflationary period that has sent everybody reeling, obviously. And then the last thing I would like to say is, before I really get into it, is the profit is not driven by the individuals that are doing the projects. There's the old saying that in construction, you don't die of hunger, you die of greed, and you die of too much work. We are in a time where it's been very busy, and actually the profit margins of a lot of contractors are going down and getting in trouble. So it's not times of too much work where you get in trouble. It's times where not times when there's little work when you get in trouble. It's times when there's a lot of work. We've seen subcontractors and suppliers go under here recently as just a result of taking on too much work. It's gluttony that kills contractors, not hunger. So I just wanted to look at a few things from a macro perspective. Let's see. So and it's not the current construction industry inflation, but I got into this industry in 1996. So my experience is 1996 to current, and again, getting on Google, and Google never lies. The average construction inflation over that time period is 3.7%. When you look at 1996, I bought my first house, $85 a square foot. In 2024, if you take that 3.7% and increase that $85 square foot home by the 3.7% until current day, that same house that cost me $210,000 in 1996 has cost me $600,000. The median house price in Missoula, again, off of Google, is $635,000. So we're not that far off of what construction inflation is. But then you look at wages. Wages has only increased 1.7 times in the same duration of time, while the cost of construction is 2.8 times. So I'm not here to make a statement, but it makes you wonder, is the cost of construction that expensive? Yes, it is, but is it really out of line, or is the cost of wages not followed appropriately? Something to ponder. Next slide. So rule of thumb is construction consists of two aspects, labor and material. In any given project, kind of a general rule of thumb, 50% of the cost is labor, 50% is material. In Montana, virtually anything you buy that's been manufactured has touched at least one additional supplier or vendor or wholesaler before it gets to Montana. In some instances, several more. Every time that's touched by another person in that chain, you're looking anywhere from a 10 to 20% cost increase. If 50% of the cost is material, you're looking at a 5 to 10% increase just because of our remote area. Weather here in Missoula and across Montana, heating and covering work and materials doesn't seem like a lot. Doesn't seem like it's that difficult, but there's considerable costs that go into it, considerable time and effort. Again, time is money. There's a contributor there, snow removal. If anybody's ever been on a project site after it snows, you take a crew of 20, 30 people and you spend a day getting rid of snow. Well, that's not very productive and it costs a lot of money. Labor is expensive. Construction means and methods. In our climate, there's a lot of things we have to do with types of construction that you don't have to do in other areas. Just like in Phoenix, Arizona, they build on a slab on grade. Here, you got to put a frost wall in, footings, and extend that foundation 4 foot below ground. Sounds easy. There's a tremendous cost that goes with that and time. So our market here in our region has some cost drivers that definitely inflates it above others in our weather, in our remote region. We'll get into the local regulation code requirements a little more in depth here. So again, back to the rule of thumb of labor and materials. If 50% of the cost of a project is in labor, we are really getting bit by the lost generation of construction. In the 90s and the 2000s, you were not seeing a lot of people enter the trades. You were seeing people get pushed towards a 4-year degree. What that's done is currently, when we see a makeup of a crew on a project site, there's only a handful of people that have been in the industry for 20, 30 years. And there's a lot of younger people there. If I go back to the beginning of my career, you'd look at a crew of 12 and there'd probably be 6 people that had been there in that industry doing that same task for 15, 20, 25, sometimes 30 years. Experience drives efficiency. And I just wanted to relate it to something probably everybody in this room has done. Has anybody ever painted their house? I hate it, but I've done it. The cost or the time it takes me to mask everything off, cut everything in, paint the wall, back roll the wall, and clean up is way more than it should take. You watched a skilled tradesman do that, and they'll do it in half the time. So that efficiency of labor is a tremendous impact to our cost of construction. So that's something that we're trying to correct in our industry, and there's been a lot more push to the trades, and I think it's been great, and I think we're all going to see the benefit of that down the road. Let's see what else we got. Regulation and code changes. The same house that was built in 1996 is not built the same way today. There's, in just a few things for energy efficiency, increased insulation requirements and more complex assemblies and installation. Every one of them is more expensive to buy. There's more material that go into it and a lot more assembly to it. More labor, more material for the same thing that you would have seen 30 years ago. Higher efficiency systems, your furnace system in your house is much different than it was 30 years ago. Now it's direct vented. You have to bring in fresh air. There's all these different requirements. I'm not debating whether they're good or not, but the reality is that's what we have to build to. There's a lot more requirement to the systems that go into building any facility. Makeup air requirements, HRV requirements, building materials access. This is huge. Timber supply. We all know what's happened this last year with some of the timber companies that have left or leaving Montana. Just access to materials is becoming harder and it's getting more expensive to bring it into Montana. A big one is sand and gravel. It's in all of our concrete, gravel underneath slabs. It's in our asphalt, sidewalks, everything. As we deplete the pits that are in Missoula County, we start trucking that stuff in from Mineral County, Sanders County, Granite County. The cost of that material is going to go up exponentially. So I'm not here to debate if that's right or wrong, but there is a cost implication with every one of those decisions that we make as a community. And last but not least, just other regulatory requirements, stormwater pollution prevention plans, increase in special inspections and testing requirements, government and financial institution reporting. It's not uncommon to have 2 to 3 people on a project site that are just taking care of the paperwork side. There's a tremendous cost on that. Spread it over a 2-year-long project, and you're adding hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars just to keep up with the task of reporting from a regulatory standpoint. So that's really all I had to share, but there's a lot of things that go into driving the cost of construction. I would love nothing more than to come to our clients and use the community and say, you know what, it is less expensive. It's 25% less expensive, 30%. But at the end of the day, we can't control a lot of these costs, and it's not just because the construction market has ramped up prices. It's actually quite the opposite. It's a tough market, and one that we hope to start seeing a more positive perspective from soon.
How about now? So we've gone a little bit over. Normally what we do on a table talk is we give you 10 minutes to communicate. We're going to give you less time. So everyone get to know your neighbor really quick. Get to figuring out what a question is. We'll convene back at 12:30, and we'll go from there. All right. Everyone got to meet their neighbor. You found a question, and we're going to have a table ambassador from your table appointed, right? We're good to go? All right, so here's the rules for some of you who have not been here before. As I said in the beginning, we are committed to civil discourse. So we ask you to keep your questions respectful, and this is the big and, avoid making long statements, okay? We are going to ask you when you stand up, we're going to ask you to state your name, but we're not going to ask for an autobiography, okay? We just need you to get to your question. We understand there's some context, but keep it somewhat brief, because you can look around the room here and see we've got a lot of people. Everyone's got a question, so we've got to try and get through as many questions as possible. We also ask the members of the media, please hold off on your questions until afterwards. The panelists will hang out for a good 5 or 6 hours for you. All right, maybe not. Okay, so what we're going to do, because I promised this, Montana's going to ask the first question. So please bear with her. It's brief, but maybe you can stand and give us your name again. Okay, just kidding.
Okay, so thank you all for that. I think that was a really concise and a little bit overwhelming, but a good summary of what you're facing in the market right now. So my question is, what do we do about it? How can we navigate this? And what maybe have you seen work in other markets that could potentially apply here?
We can be so sad. But, you know, I don't have a great answer, silver bullet. I mean, I think maybe statewide in Montana, maybe there are some resources that could be brought to bear that are new or different. I mean, locally for projects that are in an urban renewal area, you do have resources, and we're working closely with the redevelopment agency, and expect that there will be a public-private partnership that will include funds, but at least with our initial underwriting, it still doesn't quite get us there, and so we're trying to figure out how to fill the rest of the gap, and while there are a few things that exist, they're sort of on the margins, and so it seems like we might need 3 or 4 of those plus the MRA funds to get to a feasible project. And I guess one other thing just to mention that I think is unique about what we're working on right across the street is that it's a dense kind of urban form, right? Like we're going to structure some parking. We're going to go for 5-6 stories. And I do think that that has a cost associated with it that is different than if you were going to build a project perhaps further from downtown that had a lot more land and was going to be a walk-up type of product with lots of surface parking. So I do think there is a policy question here that, you know, if you want to see new construction downtown, even if it's just market rate, you know, is there a public sort of priority to get that to happen, you know, even if it's expensive? So I think that's sort of a public policy question, I think, that for the city.
Our amazing partners at the city are undertaking our Missoula the land use plan and zoning code rewrite as we speak. And as far as allowing more smaller scale infill development, it is crucial that that the product of that process is allows us to build a lot more in the areas that already have the services and the infrastructure and the amenities.
Wow, a really tough question. Back to your point, Jill, I think that's really important is there's certain places where projects should be located in areas where the cost can be controlled better. And there are certain areas where, like, affordable housing is not going to be built affordably, and downtown is one of them. With those constraints of building downtown in the dense urban area, it's just going to be much more difficult. As far as the industry in general, I think a slight slowdown is going to make a significant difference in just the competition and people willing to go out and compete for that work. And secondly, just the push to get people back in the trade so we have enough people to do the work that have the skill set and the experience to be efficient is going to create a significant change in the industry as well.
Larry Chase. Our table is a question about the possibilities of factory-built modular housing in terms of coming for infill. I mean, you get rid of some of the weather issues that you're talking about, better efficiencies from that factory. How does zoning play into that as the city is concerned? So your thoughts on that?
I have thoughts about this. I just came from 2 weeks touring the Czech Republic and Austria, looking at different sort of mass timber and prefabricated building facilities, and it was pretty amazing to see what they're doing over there. I will say that there's a couple of things that are different in our community. The scale of the factory required to really efficiently make modular buildings that people are going to want to buy is big enough that it's uncertain whether, or it'll be a stretch for a market of our size to really support one. We would see that kind of thing happening near Seattle or in Salt Lake. The problem so modular sounds great. The problem with modular is that you have anywhere from a $5 to $20 million facility worth of overhead that you have to support that any site-built builder doesn't have. You also have to ship that product, which kind of really limits the radius of service area that any factory can serve. The other problem we have is one of code. So we can have factory-built buildings in Montana where all of everything is built by Montana licensed trades, and it can be inspected by state inspectors and go to Montana. But if I want to send that to Wyoming, then I have to have Wyoming licensed inspectors and Wyoming licensed trades. Now, the exception to that is using HUD code, which is used for manufactured housing. But in order to really do that, and they have just loosened up the regulations on that quite a bit, and they allow up to 4 units now, I think, and maybe even some commercial. But HUD code requires that every unit be on a permanent steel chassis, which I think was just a thing they put in there to protect the site builders back in the 70s when this became a thing. So I think that it would be pretty important for there to be national zoning code reform or national building code reform in order for modular to really become an option for everybody.
So we've worked, we every once in a while it's like, yeah, this is a terrible way to build buildings. We got to look at modular again, and we do. And it's never been less expensive, has been the reality. I think in part because it's always a prototype, and you really would need to be, you got to be in a situation where you're going to order thousands of these units in order to start to get to the cost efficiencies that would move the needle.
And I would just add, we did have a few years ago a company called Foothold that had a modular factory in Butte, and they did deliver several homes to markets around Montana, but I think they similarly ran into zoning code challenges. I think they placed a few accessory dwelling units here in Missoula. And they also, I think, just couldn't reach the scale that was needed. And so they shut down just last year recently. So we've seen a little bit, but so far nothing at the right scale.
This is a topic that our company has really been researching, and we recently constructed a hospital in Helena that was partly modular and shipped in pods. And it saved time, and there's cost savings when you save time, but the cost of the actual construction was actually a little bit more. So it's something that will mature. I think we're early on, and there's a lot of regulatory items that need to be addressed, as we found out the hard way in Helena. But it will mature, and I think at some point in the future it will be more viable and it'll start to help bring down the cost of construction for certain types of construction, residential being probably the biggest benefactor of that.
Hi, my name is Megan Campbell. I was just curious, Jill, you had mentioned about Boise, Spokane, Eugene, and then here, and you also mentioned about being in other states. For the projects that you mentioned and did based on the inflation costs and the change, what was the time frame difference between a project getting done in Eugene versus Spokane versus Boise versus Missoula? What is that time frame difference? Because like you said, time equals money. Where's the time frame difference?
So I assume you're talking about the time to get entitlements and then building permits? Yeah. Well, let's see. So I haven't been through the process in Missoula because we're so early on in our project. So I'm probably not the right person to compare it. I mean, typically though, just for context, we assume that from when we really start the design process until we can break ground is typically best case scenario 12 months, and it can be twice that. And in Missoula, we've been working on the project for a year probably, and we're still kind of trying to get to that finish, that starting line where we have a financially feasible project and we can actually start the design process.
We're seeing projects that are in our portfolio range anywhere from 2 to 3 years from the time they start development of the project to start of construction. And it has grown tremendously, pre-COVID or even before. That was probably more like a year to 18 months. And there's a lot of factors in that, financing, design. There's so many things that extend that out. It's quite long.
Are you seeing the same thing in other states?
Very similar, yes.
Yeah, hi, Ross Mullenhauer. Our question is kind of similar to the last tables, but relative to the cities that you mentioned, what do you think is unique about Missoula that drives the costs up here in Missoula so high? Do you think Missoula's better or worse than those comparable cities like Eugene or Spokane? And what is it that is really exacerbating the cost in Missoula?
Good question. So the only comparison outside of, I guess to back up, the the northern Idaho, Wyoming, Montana markets are all very similar. The one comparison that I can draw on that is the Phoenix, Arizona area that we're building in. Seems to be about 10% less expensive. Some of that is probably due to the fact that there's just a lot more resources in the area. They have a lot less shipping and mobilization costs. There's a lot more manufactured that's closer to that. Two, there's just a lot more competition in the market. When we go out for bids here, we're very excited if we get 4 mechanical bids, 4 or 5 electrical bids. Sometimes, roofing, we're down at, getting 2 if we're lucky. Where in those markets, you're seeing a dozen. And, that's going to be a cost savings as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would just add, competition, like lack of competition with subs. And then you mentioned this in your overview at the beginning, which is just it's hard to get stuff here, and there's a cost associated with that.
My name is Nancy Seldon, and my question is much smaller scale. So there may be other people in the audience who want to speak to it. But in the case of people who want to build grandmother apartments or ADUs in the backyard, so we're not talking big subdivisions, what makes it so difficult to get through that process?
ADUs are hard because they have all the systems of a house. So it's really hard to compare them on a per square foot, construction cost per square foot, because you have all the really expensive stuff and you have very little of the gravy. The bedrooms that all you have is a little flooring and some drywall. So in Missoula, we're luckier than in the rest of the state in that ADUs are allowed, and they're allowed at 1,200 square feet, which is, a small house. But fire makes our life a little bit difficult. Power, they're often in alleys. We're not allowed to build within 15 feet of a power line. So depending on which side the power line it is, that can be a problem. Fire really wants to be able to get a really big fire engine to your ADU, which creates some constraints. But in reality, the problem is just a microcosm of the costs as a whole, is that we don't have the economies of scale to drive down all that expensive service, mechanical, electrical, hookups and tile, kitchens, appliances. That all has to be done in an ADU.
Jason Schroeder. I'm curious, are there any programs or incentives to encourage and get more folks to enter the trades industry, specifically here in Montana?
Unfortunately, nothing significant. So I think the industry here in Montana, at least, has done a really good job of taking that on ourselves and creating our own programs and apprenticeship programs and training programs and getting those certified through the State Department of Labor and Federal Department of Labor to do so. But as an industry, I think we've done very poor over the last generations of trying to create that education and draw to bring people into the trades and train them. But I think there's been a significant change in the industry of let's solve our own problem. Let's not let the state government, federal government solve that problem for us. Because it just wasn't getting done. So we've actually taken it on ourselves and are doing that.
Jana Staten, people have already asked about the affordable modular housing. I'm wondering, and maybe this is for Montana, will the land use and code reform make enough difference to change the cost structure? And can you talk about that?
I hope so. The new land use plan will be at the planning board tomorrow evening for anyone who wants to attend and provide comments. But, I'm actually really curious to hear from the panel, as you've been along for the ride with us through this process over the last year. Chris and I were talking at the beginning, we feel like it's going in the right direction. We've had a lot of really positive public response and public engagement through the process. Is it going to get us there?
The really unsatisfying answer that I probably shouldn't say is that code reform is necessary but not sufficient. Don't tell anybody. I sort of liken the land use planning in not just Missoula, but everywhere, sort of like climate change, where 40 or 50 years of bad policy have created the problem that we're in, and one 3-year process isn't going to fix it. So this is the first step, and we need to start. There's a lot more things we need to do as well. We need to get a lot more builders to become developers. We need to get a lot more people to become builders. We need to work on building code that allows innovation to happen. We need to make the trades sexy again. We need to create more innovation that allows the work to be less physically difficult so that more people want to do it. There's just, it's a lot of things, but we gotta start with the first step.
I would just say that it's definitely going to help, but the fix we're in with the construction costs is not one bullet that we're dying from. It's the old saying of 1,000 cuts is what we're dying from. So every one of them needs to be addressed, and they're all going to have an impact. So there isn't just one thing to focus on.
Thank you for that. I think that kind of mirrors what we've been experiencing, and I think this is a really exciting and really important step in the right direction. And like the panel has said, it's going to have to be a yes, and we're trying to solve a national problem at the local level. And I see some of our affordable housing partners in the room today. We, as the years have gone on, we're having to layer more and more and more types of subsidy to make projects happen. And I think code will be a big piece of providing us some additional tools, but we're going to have to keep being creative and using all of the levers that we have.
Chris, you mentioned, and I think question for all of you, what's the most innovative thing that you've seen out there that we could just talk about instead of constantly referring to a crisis? How do we look to the future? And can you articulate one innovative thing that you would want to see happen outside of money and outside of code reform?
Once again, I'll reiterate the death of 1,000 cuts, just like a construction budget. There's no one line item that solves your budget problem. You have to take 10% out of every line item. But one of the cool things that I heard about most recently was in South Bend, Indiana. The city actually sponsored sort of a meetup group of small developers, and they had an entrepreneurship class that sort of helped just normal people, many women, many minorities, to become developers, to make the jump from just doing a project here and there to doing their own development. And then they created support infrastructure, monthly meetups where they had access to staff and to the mayor, and where people could talk about subs and talk about problems. And once again, it ramped up slow, but now they have, I think, 40 or 50 new developers who wouldn't have become developers without that program.
Tim Worley, just a general question about what are your expectations for return on an investment, and do you have an example of where you were successful in getting adequate return on
Yeah, so anything that, gets built, it has been successful. I mean, at least in convincing people, you're going to get that return on investment. And then, of course, remains to be seen, right, actually how it performs over time. We typically look at, a couple different metrics. Some are more just the relationship between what's called the net operating income of the project, so just income less expenses, related to the total project cost. That's kind of like a just point in time measure. And then another really important one does take into account time value of money, and that's an internal rate of return, or an IRR. It is really dependent on perceived risk, location, where interest rates are at the time, what other options investors have, like how's the stock market doing, what is it like to invest in a money market account. But, typically that IRR, and it also depends how long you're going to hold the project, right? So a 10-year horizon, which is that's long-term in real estate, is different than a 2 or 3 year where you're going to kind of build it, lease it, and then look to sell it to generate that return. So that internal rate of return can be anywhere, I would say, on a long-term hold, 12 to 13%, and then a shorter-term hold, you're definitely trying to be in, mid to high teens is what those investors are looking for in my experience.
I get a punt. I'm a general contractor and I don't get into development.
I will say that there's a big difference between large scale, where you're getting institutional investors, and there are sort of algorithms and rubrics with which people think about these kind of projects. At the smaller scale, it just depends. So many of these projects are just driven by passion and interest and what else you've got going on. So it's really hard, but it's hard to get somebody to risk, for 10 or 15%, it has to be more,
Well, we're about 5 minutes in, or 5 minutes till, so if someone's got a short question, we might be able to squeak one out here, but if someone's got a very lengthy one, meet us next month. Here. Sorry.
Russ Fletcher. I know they aren't required in Europe. Many communities, cities, et cetera, are removing them. But what do you think the financial impact would be for Missoula if we removed parking requirements?
Well, no, I mean, I think so. I mean, for example, so I'll give an example. So Portland, which is actually where I'm located, pretty much did that, got rid of parking requirements. We only have parking maximums. We don't have any parking minimums. And a lot of projects were developed in sort of like corridors, on commercial corridors without any parking, adjacent to existing single-family neighborhoods who were, extremely upset, as you can imagine. But that was sort of the idea from a policy perspective, is like, well, that's where there's bus routes, there's things people can walk to. Like, if we want density, this is kind of what it looks like. And it's not that you can't park in those neighborhoods anymore. It's that you might have to look for parking, as opposed to being able to just park right in front of your house, which is the way it had been prior. So that's a real shift in expectations. But I do think it probably got projects built that wouldn't have been built otherwise.
Parking, it's really important to realize that if you remove parking minimums, that doesn't mean that nobody's going to build parking. It just means that the onus of how much parking to build is not on the regulator, but it's on the developer. And so the developer has to think really, really, really hard about how much parking their customers want. So in places that have removed parking, immediately what you're going to see is absolutely no change whatsoever because there is a fair amount of ramp up to these projects. And then eventually what you're going to find is that that bell curve of how much parking the average project that gets built is just going to shift ever so slightly leftward until from 1.7 to 2 parking spaces per unit, it's going to settle in 1 to 1.5 parking spaces per unit. And that's essentially where it lands. And most people who are like, well, why are they building so much parking? And it's because developers really have so much risk to take that they have to mitigate it wherever they can. And so if they think that they're going to have a hard time selling a project without parking, they're going to build the parking. So it's something that has to build up slow, and you have to, and it makes where it really helps is on the margins, the really marginal projects, the ones that are creative in different little niches. They're able to be built. The ones for aging folks, the ones the first time, the ones that we aren't getting built right now. Those are the ones that are going to get built. But on average, over the whole market, it doesn't change it very much or very fast.
All right, with that said, you can obviously tell this is complex, right? I know, Russ, we could be here all day. But anyways, I appreciate all of you coming. Couple quick things to think about. You can see this room is different than what we had at the DoubleTree. We have a capacity of 176 allowed in the room if we're going to sit the tables like this. So if you are planning on attending next month's forum, which is December 9th, please make sure that you book your reservation for food on the Wednesday before that. Okay, we have to get the food ordered prior to and all that good stuff. So please be aware of that. Silk Road Catering. Great job. So they will be catering all of our forums while we're here at the library. So anyways, with that said, thank you, Montana, Jill, Chris, and Allan. Enjoy your day.